We have tried at some point in time to pack something or put something into a container or a space too small to handle it or not uniquely fitted for it, like on vacation for a second. You ever notice the difference between packing your suitcase to go versus packing your suitcase to come home? When you go, everything fits because you folded it all neat and nice and it goes in there perfectly and you've got everything arranged right. But during the course of vacation, you're just throwing it back in there. And so surprisingly, the suitcase got smaller over vacation time so that when it's time to come home, nothing fits. And you've got stuff that you bought and you're putting it in there and you're trying to, and you know, it's just, you put like your elbow on it and you're jamming it down and then you're like punching the sides of it and jamming stuff in here and your spouse is going, it's not going to fit. And you're like, yes, it is. You're pulling on the zipper and its zipper's like this and you're just trying to force it so that the zipper's straining. And if you do get it closed, it looks like a bomb that's about to completely explode. Or maybe you've worked on a puzzle. I know this one. And you get to a point where there's just that one piece, that one empty slot that you go, I don't know where that piece is. And you're convinced that out of the millions of copies of that puzzle that were created or manufactured, yours was the box where that piece was left out. Until you find one. It's the right shape. It kind of fits. And it's got the right coloration that you kind of, if you squint your eyes, it kind of goes in that spot. And so you stick it in, but it doesn't snap the way it's, but it fits. And you kind of go, in the back of your head, you're going, it's not the piece. But because you're so tired of this puzzle, you just go, bam, 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 bam. Now it fits. And it's just kind of like warped inside of that. Or take this one. I asked my son the other day. This is just yesterday. Sorry, dude. I said, hey, you need to clean your room up, straighten your room up. He said, got it. I said, please. 5 minutes later, I'm done. You're done. Yeah. I said, you clean up your room in 5 minutes. These are his exact words. He said, I took everything that had fallen out of the closet and I shoved it back in the closet, and that's where it is. That to him is clean. We have all done this. We have all tried to force something into a space not meant to contain it. And the ending result is that the zipper on your suitcase ends up becoming completely ruined. Or that puzzle piece is so warped now and bent that not only does it not fit in the wrong spot, it doesn't even fit in the right spot now. Or for me, I am likely going to end up at the hospital this afternoon after I open my son's closet and get hit with whatever's flying out at 55 miles an hour. And the truth is that we completely do this with our faith as well. We try and force God into a space, into a box, way too small to contain him. What boxes, you might ask? If you're asking that question this morning, you've done my heart well. It means you listened last week, because that's the right question. What box? Where are these boxes? We said last week that the boxes are our routines, our rituals, our religions, our regular patterns of habits, anything that over time makes us happy, satisfied, content, comfortable. And the thing is that once we are in those confined spaces, those predictable patterns, those rituals, once we're there, we don't want God messing that up. And we said last week that he always, always does. Remember? Remember Matthew 11? How many did the homework? 6 people. Yeah. Got out of the box. Matthew 11, it says there that Matthew says that Jesus went to preach into their towns, there being his disciples. In other words, he didn't go to just foreign cities where nobody knew anybody so they could be bold because they weren't worried about their reputation. It says, no, Matthew says that Jesus went into their towns. He went into their circles of friends and family, into their places of reputation and familiarity. And there, it was in those places that he preached the kingdom and messed their lives up and forced them to choose whether they were loving him or whether they were loving their comfort and their reputation more. And it was there that Jesus told his disciples and spoke to them and said, blessed is anyone, Matthew 11:6, blessed is anyone, he says, who doesn't fall, doesn't stumble on account of me when I don't do what people expect me to do. Blessed is the one who doesn't stumble because of that. Because when it comes to our boxes of expectation around God, we said that God always, not sometimes, always goes outside of them. And then he calls to us to see if we will follow. And the truth is that we don't. As much as we would like to believe that we will follow God wherever he goes, as much as we will sing songs and say, whatever you want, I'll do, the truth of the matter is that we don't always follow God outside of our boxes. But it's worse than that. Because we also don't just sit quietly or timidly inside our zones of comfort either. Quite the contrary. What we do is that when God goes outside our boxes, we then try to force him back into them. We try to wrestle him back into the spaces of our comfort, of our predictability, of our wanting to control and contain things. We will take his word or his call on us, and we will jam it into our comfort zone like the clothes into our suitcase or the puzzle piece in the wrong part of the puzzle. We take God and we force him, or we try to force him into something that we can contain because we want to be able to comprehend what he's doing. We want to be comfortable with what he's doing. We want to be in control of what he's doing. We won't say that, but that's what happens inside of the heart. We want to be able to live how we want, and then we want to be able to still come to church, praise God, and call ourselves Christians, but we just don't want the cost of what the gospel puts on us. We don't want the risk. We don't want the uncomfortableness of it. We don't want the gospel to be controversial and say things like homosexuality is a sin, because that ostracizes us from our friends in the community around us. We don't want that part. Can't we just talk about God being loving? We don't want the gospel to be contrary and tell us that we need to be more vocal with our neighbors, because then it creates this odd dynamic every time we're outside the house and they're there because you one time said that one thing. So we go, can't I just pray for them and just hope that God talks to them? Why do I have to be the one to do it? We don't want the gospel to be convicting and call out things like gluttony or greed because we like our stuff. It makes us uncomfortable. It also makes those of us around, or makes people around us uncomfortable. And Jesus directly addresses this in Matthew chapter 11. He says, you either follow me or you don't. But there is no scenario in which God will be confined into what you want him to be. Heaven does not bow to our demands. Heaven cannot be jammed into our containers. And it's in Matthew 11 that Jesus says something that I think may possibly be one of the most debated verses in the entirety of the New Testament, if not the Bible. In the context of teaching, after sending John the Baptist's disciples back to him to say, I am the Messiah, I'm just not doing what you expected, he says this in Matthew 11, verse 12. He says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and forceful people lay hold of it. I say it's the most debated because the problem with it is that there's multiple ways it can be translated, and different versions of the Bible read this verse completely differently. It has to do with the tenses of the two verbs there is used twice, violence and violent. And it also has to do with how the language was used back then. So interpreters have to really dig into this to try to grasp and understand what was Jesus saying. You can read any study Bible, any commentary, you come to this verse, and there are paragraphs trying to describe it. But you have to go, the word's violence there, you have to ask, is it being used negatively or is it being used positively? And you would go, well, when is violence ever used positively? Well, wait a second. I grew up in the 80s. We used to define things as good by saying they were bad. Remember those days? Oh, yeah, you do. You're just not willing to admit it. We do it today. People today will say, man, that's sick. sick 99.9% of the time is a negative term, but it can also mean something is extremely awesome. That's sick. Here's the thing. In the span of a sermon this morning, I don't have the time to break down or unpack this verse the way that I would in a midweek or a Think Depth video. I don't do that. So I'm going to ask you to just allow me interpreter or pastoral license to take you where I believe the context of the passage and the chapter tells us what Jesus is saying. What does he mean by the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence and violent people take hold of it? In all likelihood, what Jesus is saying is that people do to the faith, to him, to his message, exactly what we do to suitcases and puzzles and closets. We try and force it to be what we want it to be. We try and force God to go where we want him to go. We try and force the Bible and we jam it to mean what we want it to mean. We don't want God's call so much to lay hold of us. That's too uncomfortable. We would rather lay hold of God because that puts us in control. How do we do this? A million ways. We pursue our own lives and desires, and we then say that God is blessing us and backing us in all of our personal pursuits. Maybe we buy a new car that we know is way beyond our budget, but we'll still tell people how we are blessed, implying that all of heaven shined upon that vehicle purchased. Love the laughter. Or we acquire a new house or a new job, and we don't have a clue whether God was in it or not because we didn't spend 1 ounce of time praying about it, but we will tell people after the fact, God's been good to me. Has he? Was that his will for your life? Did you actually hear from him on that matter, or are you simply laying hold of his name and his kingdom and jamming it into the suitcase of your life? In other words, we have a tendency, not because I say so, because Jesus said so, we have a tendency to lay our hands on God. We have a tendency to grab his kingdom by force and try to make it form and shape into what we want it to be. And this happens all the time. You say, not me. Oh, yeah, you. It happens to all of us because our hearts do this. The minute that we are faced with the uncomfortable nature, the conviction of the gospel, realizing it's going to call us outside of our comfort zones, maybe ostracize us among the community or among colleagues or among friends, we shrink back. And before you say, well, I don't know that it's me, let me show you just how the devout themselves get turned around in this. I want you to consider for just a moment the moment that Jesus shared with his disciples that he would have to die as a result of God's call on him, that the kingdom would require his death. Just watch this passage. Matthew chapter 16, Matthew records, he says, from that time on, Jesus began to regularly explain to his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem and that he would have to suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day and raised to life. Now, just stop for one moment. Notice for a second what Matthew said. He said that Jesus was teaching his disciples, not that he would be grabbed by the lost or the pagans or the outsiders. He says, no. It's going to be at the hands of the church. It'll be the church that will hold on to him. It'll be the elders and the priests and the teachers of the law because he will not be doing what they think he should be doing. That's how his death will come about. And in that moment, it says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. This is not happening to you. Jesus, not happening. This shall never happen to you. It says that Jesus then turned to Peter. Peter, the one who Jesus would say that he was going to build his entire church upon. He turns to him and says, get behind me, Satan. Jesus just called Peter Satan and then says to him, you, Peter, are a stumbling block to me because you don't have in mind the concerns of God. You just have in mind the concerns of men. Peter wasn't on board. Jesus' mission, the kingdom's call upon Jesus, didn't fit with what Peter wanted. So Peter takes Jesus aside and rebukes him. Catch that. Peter just rebuked God. Wow. That is amazing. That is an act of force. That is the kingdom suffering violence. That is a forceful person trying to lay hold of God's kingdom. Peter literally does lay hold of him. Look at it again, Matthew 16. It says that Peter took him aside, that Peter literally went over and said, Jesus, come here for a second. Forcefully moves him from the rest of the group and goes, not happening. Peter is instructing God on what he wants to happen. And that's where Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. He doesn't mean that Peter's demonically possessed. But he realizes that what Peter's heart is doing is that Peter's heart isn't willing to let the kingdom lay hold of him. Peter wants to lay hold of the kingdom. He wants to direct it. And that is man's rebellion from the very beginning. And that has been Satan's master plan from the very beginning, which is why the rebuke from Jesus. You see, whenever we sense that God is not performing to our expectations, we have to be deeply, deeply careful with our next step. That when God is outside of our box, we have to be very, very, very careful that we do not then try to force him back into it. Because God does not play our games. And that's not me being cute. God doesn't play our games. I'm not being cute. That's literally what Jesus says in Matthew 11 when he uses a picture illustration. Look with me, Matthew 11, verse 16. Jesus, talking to the crowds again, he says this. What do I compare this generation to? I mean, just imagine that you're in that crowd on that day and Jesus is talking to the crowd surrounding me. He goes, what do I compare you guys to? What do I come up with so that you'll understand how I see you? He says, you're like children that sit in marketplaces and you call out to one another, we played the flute for you and you didn't dance. There it is. Remember the title slide? None of you read the title slide. We played the flute for you and you didn't dance. We wailed in mourning, yet you did not weep. You go, what does that mean? Well, the reference is a little bit obscure without the background behind it. Jesus is alluding to something culturally that Matthew's readers would have picked up on, that apparently there were games that kids would play in the marketplace, and you would come along, and then they would shout out, they'd play a flute, they would shout out, and they would say, dance, do the dance. And people would walk by and go, leave me alone, kid. You know, hey, it's the morning. We're doing the dirge, the funeral thing. Do the thing. And people are like, no, I'm too busy. I get this. I grew up in a neighborhood that was a classic Little Rascals neighborhood. We had tons of kids in our neighborhood. And the summertime, we would leave the house around, Mom would kick us out of the house around 9 a.m. and go, get out! And the door would get closed and locked. No kidding. She's right here if you think I'm lying. The door got locked. But we didn't care because we split. This was before iPads and Xboxes. Man, we went outside and we never came home for the rest of the day. Maybe for lunch, maybe if there were popsicles in the freezer, but we didn't come home. And in our neighborhood, we had one of our favorite games that would rival any electronic game on any console that any kid would play today. We had a game that we played called Kick the Can. Kick the can. All it required was a can. Xboxes are like $1,000 today. We entertained ourselves with a can, and we didn't even pay for it. We went in the dumpster behind the convenience store up at this thing, climbed in and found cans and pulled them out. And the way the game worked was it required it to be night. That's when you played Kick the Can. And so we would all gather at Mike and Chris Seaman's tree in the front of his yard because they had the best yard for it because you could go all the way around their house and there were trees and bushes and all kinds of places to hide. His dad owned a boat so you could climb in that or be behind it. It was the best yard to play. So around dusk when the sun was going down, no matter where you were in whatever circle of the neighborhood you were playing that day, we all gathered at the tree. And the reason we gathered at the tree was because there was a critical step to making Kick the Can fun. It required dark clothing because when it was night, you wanted to hide. But that required a very, 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 very delicate step on the part of small kids. It meant that you had to go home. And that was a risk because parents are fickle back then. You go in the house and you don't know what you're encountering. Mom and dad may be on the couch watching Dukes of Hazzard. And if they are, you're good. Because you can run in front of them, you can run back, you can dance naked. They get out of the way. So you can run to your room, tear off your clothes, put on the dark clothes, and be like, we're leaving. They'd be like, we don't care, go. Or you could come in the house and they could be sitting at the table not watching TV. And you come in and mom would go, okay, baths. No! Mom, we're just about to get to, I don't care, it's bath time. You're in for the night. In for the night. That means you have been arrested, imprisoned, the door is locked, you're done. It's bath time because she's tired and she has to give 3 of them and she wants to go to bed and so she wants to get you to bed and so you're like, Mama, and you're pleading for your life. You don't know. So we'd meet at the tree and go, we're all going home. Everybody's coming back here. And the reason we would do that is because we always would have to take an audit to see who had been imprisoned. So when we first meet at the tree, you'd have 15 kids. We may end up with 9 and go, who got snagged? And we may try to go break them out by knocking at the door. Hi, Mrs. Hastings, can Julie and Karen come out? No, they're in for the night. Aren't you guys supposed to be in for the night? And then we'd be like running because mom's talked on phones. It's because she called, Brenda, you're letting Lane stay out late? No, he's coming home. So we would like, nope, sorry, if you got snagged, you're in. Come back, get the can, we start playing. And Mike and Chris's dad owned his own business. So he oftentimes came home late at night, and we'd be in the middle of the game. And he'd pull up in the front of the house in his red maroon Jeep Cherokee. I can still see him pulling up. And he'd get out in his suit and his briefcase. And every time, whoever was it, we had different versions of the game. We had the version where you touch the can and you yell the person's name. I see Chris. And that would mean that Chris was caught and had to be in the jail. Or we had the version where you touch the can and say, I see Chris, and that would mean Chris was it, and then you had to run. So we would play that version, and Mr. Seaman would pull up, and we'd touch the can and say, Mr. Seaman, I see him, you're it. And sometimes he'd say, well, then you better run. And it'd be like, yeah. And you'd hear, if you were hiding somewhere in the yard, you'd hear somebody come running around going, Mr. Seaman's playing, he's playing. We'd all be like, oh, because he's this big, hawking, scary dude. But oftentimes, it was, Mr. Seaman, you're it. Not tonight, guys. Not playing. You're no fun. You're boring. Come on. Didn't matter how much we'd plead with him. Not tonight. Not playing, guys. This is what Jesus is alluding to. Jesus says that he oftentimes pulls up into our life in his Jeep Cherokee, and we want him to play our game. And we call out, God, here's my tune. Here's my prayer. Here's my request. Here's what I want. Here's what I want to happen. Hey, God, dance to my tune. God, mourn to my dirge. But he doesn't. God doesn't do what we tell him to do. And then we say, only we don't do it that way. We don't, we have different verbiage for when we're disappointed with God. We'll say things like, man, I just don't feel like God hears me. Or I just don't feel like God's answering my prayers. Or we'll say, man, God is just silent with me right now. Or we'll say, I don't know that God notices me. In other words, we will express all this pain and sorrow in our life and our spiritual life that isn't great. And the reason for it isn't because God's ignoring you. It's because the zipper to your suitcase of your life is straining because of what you're trying to jam in there. And the puzzle pieces of your life are all bent and warped because you've tried to jam them where they're not supposed to go, as opposed to letting God arrange the pieces. That's why you're feeling the discontent. But here's the thing. God isn't ignoring you at all. It's you ignoring him. God isn't being silent with you. It's you being silent with him. He is showing up in your life. He is actively moving in your life. You just don't see it because it doesn't fit your box. It doesn't go into your suitcase. It doesn't go into your puzzle as you envision life and how it's supposed to be. It's because God isn't playing by the rules of your game. And again, this isn't just some pastor just trying to give you some kind of pastoral discipline or something. This is what Jesus said in Matthew 11. Notice as he continued to talk, he said this. He says, listen, John, and he means John the Baptist, he said, John came for the kingdom, and John wouldn't eat or drink. And you guys all said, that dude's demonic. He says, and then I came, and I've done nothing but eat and drink. And the response to me has been, he's a glutton and a drunkard. That guy hangs around sinners all the time. In other words, Jesus says that the kingdom of God has sent you two different people doing two different things. John the Baptist came one way, you didn't like that. I came the opposite, and you didn't like that either. And that's the largest problem. When we spend our time trying to fit God into our boxes, we will completely miss what he's doing, even when he's right in front of us. John the Baptist was right there, but those that didn't like it never saw it. Jesus was right there, but those that didn't like it never saw it. And that's the danger. God is oftentimes outside our boxes, but we are so busy trying to force him back in, jamming him in, that we miss what he's actually doing. And it happens to every single one of us. When I felt like God was first starting to ask me to return to pastoral ministry, I say return because that was my original call. I had gone to Bible school, then I went to seminary, and then I spent the better part of a decade in in pastoral ministry of a church of about 1,000 plus over in the DC area. And then God's pathway, his outside the box for me, was to send me into corporate America. And I was in there for about a decade. And I discovered corporate salaries. That's fancy terms for money. Bethesda-style money. Washington, D.C.-style money. And life was good. It was great. When you have the means to just pay for stuff and you're not worried if the car breaks down or if there's health and you go, and I was in that space for the better part of about 10 years. And then I sensed God asking me to, and telling me that that window had closed and to return back in. And I began to lay hold of him. It's not that I was trying to be disobedient. I was just trying to go. And so I was talking to everybody. If a person would sit down with me, I'd say, what do you think? Let me play this out. And everybody would say, man, if you feel like God's... But I was in my head going, what's the financial suicide here? And what's the path? And what's the cost going to be? Literally, what's the cost going to be in this process if I do this? And what are the changes that are going to have to make place? And I was just wrestling. I would come home and just debate it. And I would call people and talk to them. And then I went, wait a second. I can do both. And I went back and I talked to my colleague, chief operating officer, and I said, hey, just out of curiosity, I said, if the day ever came that I would kind of play this as a contractor role versus, being here full time, would the company ever accept these? Oh, if you wanted to, yeah. I mean, it's like, your career's safe around here. I was like, okay. And so I began to think to myself, I can do both. I can hold on to my life and I can also be obedient to God's call. That's what I'll do. I'll go and I'll just volunteer at the church. I'll just be like part-time and that, but I can still get the money. And I was constructing this pathway in this box. It was a good plan. It was so nice and neatly contained. I had everything planned out. And then one day, that same colleague, friend of mine, chief operating officer, he came in my office one day. He shut the door and sat down, put his feet up on my desk like he always did. That's as far as my leg can go on the stage. And he said, "You're done here." And I went, "What? Are you firing me?" I said, "No, I'm not firing you." He said, "I think you're done here." And I said, "What are you saying that for?" He said, "Lane," he said, "for the past 10 years, at every single senior leader, vice president meeting we have ever had, you have had an opinion in that meeting." Remember the contrarian discussion last week? He said, "You speak up if there's a plan, if there's a business goal, he says, if we just remodel the kitchen, you're like, here's my opinion." He's like, "For the past 5 months, I have sat in that room in those meetings and you haven't said a word. You're staring out the window." He said, "I went to dinner last night with our CEO and I told him," he said, "I think Lane's done." He said, "So I'm coming to just tell you, I don't care what you do. Your job's safe. You want to stay here, stay. You want to be a contractor, be a contractor. We'll do whatever you want us to do. I'm telling you, I think you're done." And I said, "I don't think so." How obstinate is that? How stubborn is that? And I said, let me talk to you tomorrow about this. I was like, my head's on a whole bunch of stuff. And so I got in the car and I called Brian and I said, "Let me tell you what this guy just said to me." And he's like, "How stupid are you, Lane? How do you not hear God plainly talking to you?" He said, "That's not Bash saying that. That's God saying that to you. You are hearing him answer your question clearly, but you're so wrapped up with your plan, you don't see it." And I know he's right. And every single one of us do this. We create our plans, our paths, our boxes, and then we try to take and lay hold of God forcefully and jam him into that. And when you do that, the danger is not that you're going to make God mad, it's that you will be blind to what he's doing right in front of you. Let me close with this passage in John chapter 5. And I want to read the Message, Eugene Peterson's version of it. This is Jesus talking to the religious rulers of his day. He says, "You have your heads in your Bibles constantly because you think you're going to find eternal life there, but you miss the forest for the trees. These scriptures that you're reading, they're all about me. And now here I am standing right in front of you, and you aren't willing to receive from me the life that you claim you want." I love that. You miss the forest for the trees. You have your own plan. You're so zeroed in and zoomed in on your plan and what you're going to do that you miss the larger picture of what God is doing right in front of you. So let me ask you. Last week, the question was, where are your boxes? The question this week is, where are you trying to force him and his kingdom, his message into those so much that you can't see what he's doing right in front of you? Has he been silent for a while? Has he been absent from you for a while? Have you not noticed him for a while? Have you not seen him move in your life for a while? The odds are he is. It's you that are distracted. So what do you need to do? How can you take those steps to say, I'm done trying to force him into my paradigm. I'm going to let him be Maybe it's scary. Maybe you feel him calling you into something. Maybe you feel him urging you into something. Maybe he's calling you to a new pathway of life. Maybe he's calling you to a new pathway of missions. Maybe he's calling you to a larger realm of financial giving. Maybe he's calling you to release. Whatever the case is, whatever it is, if it feels like he's taking you outside your box, follow him